Hello, my name is Kayla Grimshaw, and today I would like to talk to you about a man named Gregor Mendel and how he contributed to the study of heredity. Ever since I was younger, I've always found genetics and how they work to be very interesting. Because of this, I've spent the last few years studying Mendel's experiments and genetics as a whole, inside and outside of my biology classes. Gregor Mendel was the first man to discover why offspring tended to look like their parents. Through his discoveries, he changed what people thought they knew about genetics forever. According to Ilona Maiko in her paper titled Gregor Mendel and the Principles of Inheritance, before Mendel's discoveries, people just believed that traits in offspring resulted in a blending of traits from each parent. Now, because of Mendel, we now know that genetics is more scientific and more complicated than that. Due to Mendel's experiments, we now know more about heredity than we did before. Mendel built the foundation of genetics as we know it. When talking about Mendel, I will explain his experiments, the results of said experiments, and I will end by talking about the conclusions Gregor Mendel came to because of his results. Gregor Mendel began a study of genetics in 1856. Mendel performed experiments with pea plants in order to study the passing of traits from parent to offspring. The website DNA from the Beginning, in the section titled Children Resemble Their Parents, it states that over the years in his research, Mendel grew over 10,000 pea plants. In his experiments, Mendel started with purebred pea plants, called the pea generation. The plants were purebred because they had been self-pollinating for generations. This means they could only produce offspring with one trait. He then crossbred the purebred tall plants with the purebred short plants. Mendel did this by transferring the pollen from one plant to another using a small paintbrush. The result of this crossbreeding was called the F1 generation. Mendel then crossbred the offspring of the F1 generation, creating the F2 generation. Through these experiments, he discovered what people had believed for thousands of years was just not true. Through the experiments, Mendel discovered that the plants had not been mixing the traits, but showing either the tall or short trait. After crossbreeding the P generation, Mendel discovered that all of the F1 generation showed the tall plant trait. According to Modern Biology, written by John Paulswaite and Janet Hobson, Mendel's first crossbreeding, the creation of the F1 generation, resulted in all tall plants and no short ones. The creation of the F2 generation, however, showed different results than the F1 generation. Mendel found that in the F2 generation, some short plants were shown, along with the tall ones. There was a 3-to-1 ratio of tall plants to short plants. With these results, Gregor Mendel came up with the basic laws of genetics. Now knowing that what people originally thought about parents and their offspring wasn't true, Mendel created the terms and laws of genetics that we now all know. The basic terms that he came up with included heredity, genetics, traits, and alleles. He called the passing of characteristics from parent to offspring heredity, and the study of heredity was now called genetics. According to Modern Biology, the different variants of the characteristics were called traits. Traits were expressed because of alleles, different forms of genes passed from offspring from their parents. For each trait, you get one allele from your mother and one from your father. Through his experiments, Mendel discovered that certain traits were more likely to be expressed than others, such as how the tall plants were more likely to be shown than the short plants. This was due to the tall characteristic being a dominant trait and the short characteristic being a recessive trait. The dominant traits cover up the recessive trait. So, if you get one dominant allele from your mother and one recessive allele from your father, then you will show the dominant trait. According to Hank Green in his video titled Heredity Crash Course Biology Number 9, in order to express a recessive trait like the short plants, you must receive a recessive allele from both parents. Mendel was able to predict the probability of what characteristics the offspring would show using a Punnett square. A Punnett square is a diagram used to predict the traits of offspring based on the alleles of their parents. This is an example of a Punnett square. As you can see, the parents are shown on the tops and the sides, and as you can see, the parents have one dominant and one recessive allele each. Based on these results, you can see that this offspring will receive both dominant alleles from their parents. These two will receive one dominant and one recessive allele, and only this one will receive both recessive alleles. Because of this, these three offspring will show the dominant trait, while this one is the only one showing the recessive. In this speech, I first explained Gregor Mendel's experiments, and then I went into more detail of the results of said experiments. After that, I concluded with talking about how his results led him to come to the conclusions and make up the terms and laws of genetics that we know now. Gregor Mendel's experiments changed everything that people thought they knew about genetics. He was the first person to actually discover what was causing offspring to look like their parents. Mendel built the foundation of what we now know about genetics. In conclusion, Gregor Mendel, nicknamed the father of modern genetics, was the man to disprove the beliefs that people had about genetics for many years. His research was monumental in the discovery of genetics, and Mendel, with his pea plants, created the foundation of genetics that others have now built upon throughout the years. Thank you for listening to me talk about Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics.